Okay, this is part 6. We are on slide 30 of our eukaryotic microbes, looking at the protozoans. Classification, identification, reproduction, and medical importance. So on to slide 31. Protozoa means animal-like, or it means first animal. Proto meaning first, zoa meaning animal. And just like our algae and our protists in general, it's a very general term that doesn't have any real evolutionary significance. Because in a scheme like this, that is trying to organize organisms based upon their actual evolutionary relatedness, you can see that we are pulling all of the blue boxes out from all these various different strands, and we are lumping them together into this group, the protozoans. So, before we could go in and read the genomes of organisms, we would classify things based upon what they looked like and how they behaved and maybe where you found them. So the protozoans do all have a very kind of general similarity, but on a genetic level they're very different. So in that general sense, they have no chloroplasts, so they are all heterotrophic. They are all unicellular, and those cells have no cell walls. So they are unicellular, heterotrophic, eukaryotes, and they don't fit very easily into the other places of the 6 kingdoms. Used to be the case that they were classified by the means of their locomotion. Some protozoans have flagella, and they spin that flagella, and that propels the organism. Some protozoans have little hairs, or hair-like, beating whip-like structures on their surface, typically all over their surface, called cilia, and those cilia could beat, and that would move the protozoan around. And then there are some amoeboid-like protozoans. They have these protrusions called pseudopods, and they have their nucleus, and then they can pump their cytoplasm into a pseudopod, and they can extend it, and through this mechanism of extending and pumping, they can start to creep around their environment. Typically, our protozoans want to be moving around their environment for a few reasons. First of all, because they are heterotrophic, they want to move around to find food, and secondly, they often want to move around to find reproductive partners. On to slide 32 here. A quick look at the protozoan life cycle. Typically 2 stages in the life cycle. There is a trophozoite phase and a cyst phase. Troph means to feed, zoite, kind of animal. So the trophozoite is kind of the mobile feeding stage. And the cyst is the resistant resting stage. It's the cyst that is typically the means by which the protozoan gets transmitted. Often the cyst is passed from an infected animal in its feces, and then the feces, the cysts get into the environment, and then they are eaten by another organism. Or a cyst can lodge itself in, say, the muscle of an animal, and then that animal will be eaten by a predator and again ingested, and the cyst will be ingested, and then when it gets inside the other animal, it can hatch and become the trophozoite. So environmental conditions will trigger cyst formation, and then will trigger the hatching of the cyst into the trophozoite. If a trophozoite runs out of food, or it dries up, or it experiences any of these conditions, it may turn into a cyst, just kind of wait out those conditions, or it's produced as a cyst as a transmission mechanism. Some cysts can develop cell walls that help them to be protected as they are transferred. Also, if they're going to be required to be eaten, they're going to have to withstand the stomach acid. Cryptosporidium. So Cryptosporidium, that was one of those organisms. The cyst of that organism was one of the important organisms that need to be treated in water treatment plants. Okay, let's move on to our types of protozoan. And our first type is an apicomplexan. And our apicomplexans typically have this kind of teardrop shape, and they have an apex. An apex just means a point or a tip. So this is the apex, and at the apex they have this complex structure that allows them to penetrate host membranes. So it's called apical complex because the structure, this complex structure, is at the apex of the organism. This is a single cell. Many of these apicomplexans are intracellular, which means they get inside your cells. Often they have those complex life cycles. They can have asexual and sexual forms. One example that you should know is Plasmodium. Plasmodium causes malaria, and malaria is when the Plasmodium gets inside red blood cells. We'll talk about the significance of malaria later on, but it is one of the most important diseases in the world. Another disease you may have heard of that is caused by apicomplexans is toxoplasma or toxoplasmosis, caused by Toxoplasma gondii. Another interesting disease in how it is transmitted. It's often transmitted from mice to cats and then back to the mice. And toxoplasmosis is a disease that has this kind of unusual this kind of behavior modification aspect. When the mouse gets infected with the cysts and gets an infection of the parasite changes the mouse's behavior. The mouse becomes less afraid. The mouse becomes more exploratory. It's out in the open more often, and you'll often see mice that have an infection of toxoplasmosis just sitting out in the open. So what the toxoplasmosis is doing, it's modifying the mouse's behavior and making it easy for that mouse to be caught by a cat, and then the cat eats the mouse, and the cysts in the mouse muscle get transmitted to the cat, and then the parasite reproduces in the cat, and the cysts come out of the cat in the feces. This is the life cycle of malaria. I'm not going to go into any details of the life cycle, just to say that it is very complex with lots of different stages and lots of different things going on inside the life cycle of the Plasmodium parasite. Lots of these protozoans that cause diseases are moved around by things like insects. Mosquitoes are central to malaria. So next on our list of protozoans are diplomonads and parabasalids. And I'm going to focus on the diplomonads. Again, the di portion of the name gives you a hint about how to recognize these cells. They have these kind of two halves. You can see this is Giardia. It's a single cell. It kind of has a split down the middle, and it has two nuclei, one on either side. So typically have two nuclei inside the cell. They have flagella, and Giardia is a very important disease that causes diarrhea. And this is the picture of a digestive tract covered in Giardia. Giardia are damaging the intestinal tract, and they are just kind of swarming it. It means you can't digest and uptake the food. So diplomonads, di meaning two, these kind of two-part cells with two nuclei. Another interesting feature of the diplomonads and the parabasalids is that they lack mitochondria. So these are eukaryotes because they have a membrane-bound nucleus, but they didn't ever go through that second step. If you remember back to your endosymbiotic theory, they never went through that second step of capturing a free-living microbe and turning that into a mitochondria. Our parabasalids live inside hosts, and these are again quite interesting. They live in termites, and these are the organisms that give the termites the ability to digest cellulose. And in fact, it's not actually the parabasalids themselves. It is a symbiotic bacteria inside the parabasalid, inside the termite, that allows the termite to digest cellulose. Termites, being animals, don't have the ability to digest cellulose, and only really fungi have that ability. So the termite eats the wood, that's passed to the parabasalid, and that's passed to the bacteria, and the bacteria does the breaking down. All of these things living together in a symbiotic relationship. There are some disease-causing parabasalids. Trichomonas vaginalis infects the UTI of both men and women. And they have, again, they don't have mitochondria, but they have this other membrane organelle called a hydrogenosome. And this is a place where they can produce ATP at the same time as they generate hydrogen. So it's kind of analogous to a mitochondria. Mitochondria, if you recall, very important, central to a eukaryote's ability to undergo respiration. Many of the reactions happen inside the mitochondria. Here, the parabasalid has an ability to make ATP through a different biochemical pathway, and it makes hydrogen gas as a byproduct. Next on our list are kinetoplastids. They have one flagella, and you can recognize them by a big mass of DNA in their mitochondria. They have a single mitochondria. The mitochondria itself has a very distinct structure, and you can recognize is the DNA stained in these kinetoplastids. You can see their nucleus and their mitochondria. So when it comes to trying to kill protozoans, it's very difficult because the protozoans are so similar to our animal cells. But one target for drugs is this kinetoplastid DNA, because it is unique to the kinetoplastids. There are some very important diseases that are caused by kinetoplastids. Leishmania. This is a disease, it's transmitted by flies, in this case sandflies. We'll look at Leishmania in just a second. Or maybe we won't, but at some point I think so. And then we have trypanosomes. These cause a disease called sleeping sickness. What they do is you get bitten by the fly, you get the trypanosome. The trypanosome parasite produces a chemical called tryptophan, and it quite literally induces sleep in the human. Next on our list of protozoans are Labosians and heterolabosians. These are amoeboid-like cells. The way I remember that they're amoeboid-like cells is by thinking of the shape of an amoeba, and I can think of one of these as being a lobe, like an earlobe. So I can see from the name Lobosians and heterolabosians. These organisms have lobes, and then that helps me remember that they are amoeboid-like. So they crawl around their environment, they extend and retract their pseudopodia, they engulf their food by this process of phagocytosis, extend their pseudopods around their food source, completely engulfing the food source until the food source is enclosed in a membrane that we would call a phagosome, and then it'll send in its digestive enzymes in its lysosomes to break down that organism and turn it into a source of food. You may have heard of a very famous heterolabosian. Again, amoeboid. They can also form flagellated cells and Naegleria fowleri. Naegleria fowleri swims in water. It assumes an amoeboid form. It enters a human who gets unlucky, and it starts to eat their brain. So Naegleria fowleri, also known as the brain-eating amoeba. Now, it's important to realize that the brain of a human is not the place where Naegleria fowleri wants to end up. It wants to go about its regular business in the water. From cyst to trophozoite, back to cyst again, just doing its thing. But an unlucky human gets in the way. It gets the parasite up in its nose, and then the parasite kind of gets confused. It hatches into the trophozoite phase, and it's almost always fatal. The humans are what we would call a dead-end host, however, because once the Naegleria fowleri gets in, it doesn't get back out again. So it's just as deadly for the parasite as it is for the person. There's no cure for brain-eating amoeba. There have been some cases of people have used neti pots. So you fill up that little pot and you stick it in your nose to try and wash out your sinus cavities, but you use, say, tap water or well water that's contaminated with Naegleria fowleri, and you are just introducing the parasite into the wrong place. So that's the end of our list of organisms. Just a couple more things about protozoans and their reproduction. Protozoans have a specialized form of reproduction called schizogony, also known as multiple fission. This is one of the nasty symptoms of malaria, in that a malaria sufferer will feel okay, and then suddenly they have these fever paroxysms, or these severe attacks of fever. And that's because of the life cycle of the plasmodium that's causing malaria. They grow and they multiply within a cell, and then the cell bursts and a whole bunch of offspring are released into the blood, and they trigger a huge immune response. So we can have protozoans reproducing via mitosis. We can have protozoans getting together and undergoing meiosis. They undergo meiosis, they exchange nuclei and they exchange chromosomes with each other. They recombine those chromosomes and then they go through cell division. So this is true sexual reproduction because of the exchange and the recombination of chromosomes. But a very important mechanism seen in many protozoans is this mechanism of schizogony, where an infected cell, the reproductive cell goes through these multiple divisions within the cell, and then the cell bursts to release lots and lots of progeny. So there are lots and lots of protozoans out there. Most do not cause disease, but there are obviously very, very important protozoan pathogens. Malaria. 290 million people suffer from malaria each year, with around 660,000 deaths. So much more significant than coronavirus will ever be. But one thing about malaria is it happens in mostly what we consider third world countries. We don't think about malaria in the Western world. One reason is that we don't have it. We don't have it because the insect, the mosquito that moves the malaria parasite around is only found in certain parts of the world. based upon things like temperature and moisture. So it's kind of more central in equatorial regions. So malaria affects people who are already poor, and then there's not a whole lot of impetus to make a cure. It would take a lot of money to make a malaria cure. Malaria, very difficult to treat because it's a protozoan. Protozoans are eukaryotic, and they're so similar to human cells. So just the one unfortunate consequence is that there are no drug manufacturers who are going to invest in a malaria cure, simply because the amount of money they would put in would never equal by a long shot the amount of money they could make from that malaria cure. One way that we can try and combat malaria is to combat the mosquito. So sleeping under nets, for example, spraying to kill mosquitoes. There was a big push to kill the mosquito that causes malaria not that long ago. We used a chemical called DDT, and it was killing mosquitoes very effectively. Turned out that DDT was a very toxic substance in the environment and got banned. So, going to be difficult to treat malaria, and even today it is a huge problem in many parts of the world. Amoebiasis, amoebic dysentery, affects millions of people per year, kills 100,000. Cryptosporidium and Giardia, among the leading causes of diarrhea in the world. Trypanosomes, that one that causes sleeping sickness. There are, again, regions in Africa, because that's where the fly that transmits the trypanosomes lives. Some places in Africa are uninhabitable, and they have been for centuries, simply because you can't live there without getting bit, and if you get bit, you get trypanosomes, and you fall asleep and eventually die. Toxoplasma gondii, toxoplasmosis. You may have heard about this in regards to cats, cleaning out your cat litter box or coming into contact with cat feces. Pregnant women are often told to avoid cleaning out their cat litter box. We'll talk about some of the ideas about why pregnant women should be trying to avoid infection later on in the semester. On to the study guide. Characteristics. What does protozoan mean, and what are the characteristics? Single-celled, no cell wall, heterotrophic, eukaryotes. And then these are the ones you need to know. Apicomplexans. How would you recognize one? By its shape, by that apical complex that allows it to penetrate cells. Plasmodium causes malaria. Diplomonads and parabasalids. Diplomonads, di meaning two. Those are those cells that have the two nuclei and the flagella. An example would be Giardia. Parabasalids. These are the ones also have, they lack the mitochondria, like the diplomonads too. They have this membrane enclosed organelle called a hydrogenosome instead. These are the ones that give the termites, and indeed these are the ones that have the bacteria in them that then confer the ability in the termites to eat away wood. Kinetoplastids, those are the ones with the funky DNA in their mitochondria. That unique kinetoplast DNA makes them a target for drugs. Leishmania, a nasty disease triggered by sandflies. There's the result of leishmania. Trypanosomes, one that cause sleeping sickness, again transmitted by biting flies. Lobosians and heterolobosians, the lobe part, they are amoeboid-like. The heterolobosian, Naegleria fowleri, does not want to eat your brain because it is a dead end for the parasite. Parasite gets in, but it doesn't get out. It can't complete its life cycle inside a human. Reproduction. We looked at a couple of slides about reproduction. The general life cycle of a cyst and a trophozoite. So be able to tell those two structures apart. The trophozoite, the feeding stage, the cyst. Typically it is the cyst that is the transmission phase. The cyst is typically it's resistant. It's the resting phase. Schizogony is an additional mechanism that protozoans have for reproduction. They can do all the regular stuff like mitosis and meiosis, and asexual and sexual reproduction. But in addition, they can go through this process of multiple fission. It's particularly seen in malaria, and it gives malaria some of its most unpleasant symptoms. Importance, not that many, but those that do affect us in very large numbers. Malaria in particular, caused by Plasmodium. Many causing diarrhea and other nasty intestinal diseases. Trypanosomes, making regions of Africa uninhabitable. Toxoplasmosis. Pregnant women should avoid cleaning their litter boxes. If they have, cleaning their cats' litter boxes. Okay, that is enough for this set of lectures. I'll post up the lecture slides. I'll post up, obviously, hopefully you've watched these videos, and that is everything for this particular set.